Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. Remember Dennett's eliminativist claim that there is no place or time where it all comes together in consciousness. He thought that there was no fact of the matter about what's in consciousness or not in consciousness, or the way Blackmore talks about it. There's no magic difference between what's conscious and what's not conscious. For the eliminativist, all there is are easy problems. There's sensation, memory, attention. Once we explain those, we're done. There's no extra thing that's consciousness. And you'll remember that Dennett had this objection about parallel distributed brain processes, that there's information processing going on all over the brain all the time, and so there's no single place that it all comes together in consciousness. But then there's still this question about time. The Cartesian materialist could say, well, everything that's conscious is somehow doing something at the same time, even though they're distributed across the brain in terms of where they are in their processing. So one of the worries about timing and conscious timing was due to a study, controversial study by Benjamin Libet. And this study is really difficult to explain, so I've recruited some help to try to keep my lefts and rights together as I'm explaining how this study works. So what happened in Libet's study is that he showed that the order of arrival of two signals in the cortex does not determine the order in which a subject is conscious of those signals. So what he did was stimulated, he had access to the subject's brains, and he could stimulate the cortex directly. And so he started by stimulating what felt like the subject's right hand, right? So you stimulate this and he feels like his right hand. Even though it's on the left side of the brain, your hemispheres are crossed. So you stimulate this first, and then you stimulate the left hand directly on the skin, all right? So you get cortical stimulus, then skin stimulus, right? So this is happening first, and it's happening right there in the brain. So you'd expect the subject to feel this first, feel the right hand first, and then feel the left hand. But subjects report the opposite. They report feeling the left hand be stimulated first, and then the right hand. Look at the specifics of the timing for this study. So we start with 0, the cortical stimulation on the right. That's when the study begins, that's when the testing begins. And then 200 milliseconds later, we stimulate the skin, and that's the left hand stimulus. Libet argued that there was a 500 millisecond delay between cortical stimulus and the conscious experience. This is the half-second delay, that it takes a half-second for a stimulus to reach what he called cortical adequacy, or the cortical threshold to consciousness. And so we would expect then from the 0 point of the cortical stimulation for the right hand at 500 milliseconds, we would have the experience of, the conscious experience of the right hand being stimulated. And then we would expect that 700 milliseconds, that is 500 milliseconds after the 200 millisecond mark, for the left hand, the skin stimulus, we would expect to have the experience of the stimulation of the left hand. So we would expect you, for this study, to report experiencing the right hand first and then the left hand. But again, what subjects report is the reverse. How is it possible that you stimulate the cortex directly and then later stimulate the hand? In fact, the hand, it takes a while for the hand stimulus to get up to the cortex, so you'd expect even a later delay than the 500 milliseconds later after the skin stimulus. But you get the reverse order. So how is this possible? How can we explain this phenomenon? The first explanation is dualist, and this was Libet's own explanation of these results. He said that what we have is temporal referral. And what he thought was that the left-hand signal is actually sent back in time in order to appear in consciousness before the right-hand signal. So it occurs in this non-physical conscious mental field where then you have the reverse temporal order of the actual physical relationship. And this is dualist because it violates the laws of physics. The laws of physics say that things happen in a causal order, and you have stimulation at one time and then another stimulation at another time, and you can't reverse those times. Things, entropy expands, etc. So we only have, time only moves in one direction. And so if consciousness can reverse the temporal order, then this is a major overruling of the laws of physics. And so this is the big excitement for the Libet study, that we have proof of dualism in this temporal referral. Now, lots of materialists argued that this was a mistaken interpretation and that there were other, more moderate explanations of this phenomena. So, for example, Dennett argues that a materialist explanation is temporal representation. What happens is not that you refer the actual feeling of a signal back in time. What happens is that the brain signal represents a different time, that the left-hand signal reaches the cortex after the right signal, right? That's what we expect according to the laws of physics, that you stimulate the right and then you stimulate the left, and that's what's going on in the cortex. But what's represented is that the order is reversed. So you simply represent the right hand after the left hand, all right? So you don't have to have a conscious field where you reverse the order, you simply represent them as reversed order. And this is analogous to what happens with spatial representation. So if I'm sitting here and there's a 6-foot table in front of me, I can represent that that table is 6 feet long without having a 6-foot long representation in my brain. Even if I have a spatial representation that's topographical, and it looks like our retina, or that is to say, our retina is topographically representing spatial relations. So there's a point on my retina that's next to another point on my retina that represents 2 points that are next to one another at the table, but those relations aren't representing all of the spatial distance of the table. Again, otherwise I would have to have a 6-foot representation of a table in my brain in order to represent a 6-foot table, and we just don't. We know that this doesn't happen. So spatial representations can occur in the brain in all kinds of different ways. They don't have to mirror the spatial representations of the things that we're representing. And similarly with time, we don't have to have temporal representations in the brain that match the temporal signals of the world, or even the temporal signals of the brain. What Dennett talks about here is a distinction between vehicle and content. The brain is the vehicle, the different neurons are the vehicle of representation. The content is what's represented. One way another philosopher, Fredretsky, talks about this distinction. He says, in a book, the vehicle is the book, it's the page and the ink of the book. The content is what the book is about. So it could be about fairies and dragons, it could be about Paris, someplace far away. So the vehicle is one thing, what it represents is another thing. And these two don't have to have the same properties. And so we can represent temporal relations in a different sort of way than by having the same brain timing as the content that we're representing. Dennett presents this as support for his multiple drafts theory, and it does work for the multiple drafts theory, but I would argue that it works also for other forms of Cartesian materialism, that a Cartesian materialist can also adopt this sort of explanation, can also adopt a representational theory of consciousness. And we'll look at some of those later on. In particular, the higher order theory of representation is going to specifically adopt representation as part of its explanation of consciousness, and so it can use this explanation in support of its way of dealing with Libet's theories.